In Sri Lanka, after the end of the three-decade-long war, attention turned towards development. In some parts of the country, the projects were rapid and massive: airports, harbours and highways. Douglas Kay says after years of being inhibited by the war, there is a need for speedy development, but he also issued a warning. If the development activity is not done in a sustainable manner, it could have grave consequences.
I've been here for now 5 years, and I was here at the end of the war, and very interesting. Sri Lanka is quite unique in world history and certainly in world affairs today in terms of the suddenness and abruptness with which the conflict here ended. You know, we can all know the exact date and almost time when the war here ended. Now that doesn't usually happen in other countries of the world or in conflict situations. And so what happened here was 27 years of pent-up change, political, economic, and social. All of a sudden it was like a horse race. The gates just opened up and have been since for the last 3 years. Really, these processes of change have been rolling very, very quickly ahead. On the economic front, therefore, we hear a lot about the tourism growth potential, and certainly that is very much reflected in the number of first-time visitors here. The investments, both by Sri Lankan companies in other parts of the country, as well as maybe not as much as the government would like so far, but as well as foreign direct investment to Sri Lanka. The end of it is that the growth that's happening right now has a very big risk of becoming unsustainable growth, very environmentally unfriendly growth, very ungreen growth, and ultimately unsustainable growth. Sri Lanka, one day, unless the world and unless Sri Lanka gets its act together, Sri Lanka, in my view, within 20 years could be the poster child for disasters.
One of the major themes of the Rio conference was the green economy. Working towards a green economy can be a big investment, and for small developing nations, it could be a burden to economic prosperity. In a speech at Rio, President Mahinda Rajapaksa pointed out that the agreements reached at the conference should not hinder economic development, particularly in developing countries.
Macroeconomic policies that we set forth today at this conference must be developed through a framework which includes an environmental sensitivity, but without hindering the development space for countries that are developing.
Douglas Kay says it's a part of the ongoing debate between industrialized countries and those in the developing world. It is the same rhetoric used by countries such as India and China. Developed countries, mainly Western nations, are blamed for creating much of the environmental problems and being slow to make their own sacrifices. Developing nations are accused of engaging in a blame game and being unwilling to make sacrifices of their own. Douglas Kay calls it economic nationalism.
Before we move on a little bit more to climate change, I do want to touch upon the green economy that you mentioned. President Rajapaksa in Rio did talk about moving into a green economy, but he also said it shouldn't slow down the economic development of the country. Now, as you mentioned, of course, we're finishing up a 30-year war, struggling to get our economy on track, and green economy requires a lot of investment on part of the public and the private sector. Do you think that in this economic climate, Sri Lanka can make those significant investments to go towards a green economy?
Well, let me answer your question in two parts. Okay, first, how President Rajapaksa, what are the sentiments that underlined his statement? Basically, it's a sentiment that's shared in many parts of the developing and emerging economy world right now. India, you hear this a lot in India. India, this whole climate debate has unfortunately been conflated with a type of, for lack of a better term, I would use economic nationalism. Basically, the argument, as you hear it in India, goes like this. You, the industrialized countries, the main problem makers of global climate change, have had your way to grow without any restraints for the past century, since the dawn of the industrial age. And now it's our turn. It's our turn, India. It's our turn, China. It's our turn, Brazil. It's our turn, Sri Lanka. So don't you, the West, who's actually the one that's making all this problem, all of a sudden tell us that we can't follow the same path of consumption and production.
Don't you think
Now,
there's some
I think
justification to that?
that's a That's an unfortunate way of seeing things, because ultimately, at current rates of production and consumption, the ones who will suffer the most, and the most immediately, are precisely the countries like Sri Lanka. So in my view, this type of economic nationalism is slightly unfortunate, because it misses the point that the blame game needs to end. And we all need to understand that at current forecasts, at current rates of consumption, how we as a society are living, all of us will pay the price. But it'll be these countries that suffer the most. Now let me answer the second part of your question the most. Can we afford this? My question to you is, how can we afford not to do this? You see, what's happened in the West, the United States is a very good example. Low cost of fuel, electricity is cheap. The costs, the investments into real sustainable type of growth, green growth, are minimal. The problem is the real cost to our environment, the real cost to our societies, the real cost to our children and their lives and their grandchildren are not being factored in. You see, it's not like we need to pay more to have a green economy. We're not paying enough, and we haven't for the past century. And only now do these decisions need to be made. We need not only to pay more, we need to pay what we should have been paying all along, because these negative impacts have not been priced into the way we live.
If I could just present a counter-argument to what you were saying between the struggle between the West and the or developed or developing countries arguments, something that developing countries are saying is, yes, we do realize we have a part to play, however, the developed countries are not doing enough. With some of their policies with regard to, especially in the United States, policies for addressing climate change. So their argument is sort of, yeah, okay, we will do it, but since you've been contributing most to the problem, why not you do some more to address the problem? How could you go around?
I think they're right. Neither the industrialized countries, nor the West, nor the South, nor the developing countries are doing enough. None of them are doing enough. In fact, if you look at current rates of carbon emissions, yes, the West and the industrialized countries are, in absolute terms, the ones that are producing by far the most. Right. But if you look over the past 10, 20, 30 years, however you want to look at it, certainly the past decade, the rate of increase in terms of carbon emissions is by far much faster in the developing world. So again, they both have a big responsibility. My fear is, given the lack of global political support to make the sacrifices required to get a control on this problem, the problem's going to get much worse before it gets better. And unfortunately, the problem with greenhouse gases is it's like a shower that doesn't work too well. You can turn on the hot water and you're not feeling the hot water yet, and you just crank it up all the way, and only later does it come very hot and burns you, and even trying to reduce it, it's still coming out burning. You see, for greenhouse gases, that period of burning lasts not just a day or a year, it lasts for 10,000 years. So unless we get a very rapid handle on reducing our emissions, we're going to be dealing with a very hot Earth for at least 10,000 years.
Disaster risk reduction was another major theme of the conference, and this is one area that Sri Lanka appears to be getting right. According to Kay, Sri Lanka is better prepared for natural disasters than it was during the time of the tsunami.
Go on to another related but different theme, was disaster risk reduction. How could you say that Sri Lanka, what steps have we taken? Say the tsunami was obviously the biggest sort of knock on our heads, that we were not prepared enough. Since then, do you think Sri Lanka is better prepared for the various natural disasters that we face?
I do believe that. And I think the relationship that we as UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, have had with the government of Sri Lanka in supporting Sri Lanka's efforts to prevent the next disaster, to be able to respond more effectively to the next disaster, have been very, very positive. The establishment of the Disaster Management Center, the DMC, is a very, very concrete example of very strong cooperation between the UN system and the government of Sri Lanka, bringing our technical support and lessons learned from other parts of the world, and supporting the government's clear political commitment to making sure that Sri Lanka is better prepared to minimize and prevent disasters, and respond in the case of what will inevitably be more disaster.
One issue that you brought up earlier was the delay of monsoons and the droughts that could happen if we don't see any more rain. That's also, in a sense, mitigating a disaster in the making, and we're hearing power cuts already. The potential of power cuts. I mean, do you think we're any better prepared for that type of a scenario where people don't think of a tsunami as such, but a drought is just as significant on the livelihoods of people?
Well, again, there's two broad categories of ways to handle these issues. One is what we call mitigation, and that's really an issue that's faced by many of the developed countries, mitigating the level of greenhouse gas that you emit into the atmosphere. One is adaptation, and that's getting ready for a world that will be much more, where disasters will be much more prominent. I'd say in every country of the world there needs to be a mix between the two, but certainly here in Sri Lanka we want to err more on the side of adapting, because again, Sri Lanka is not a major industrial producer. It's not a big emitter of carbon-based fuels, although it is increasing here. So I think with regard to getting ready for the next major droughts, I think the government's done about as much as it could so far. We've been working very closely with it in terms of carrying out a natural hazards mapping of the country over the past 2 years. We've undertaken a very extensive risk assessment of all the not us, but supporting the government, and about 16 different agencies within the government, to look at all the possible filters of disaster, the impact on water resources, the impact on forests, the impact on heritage sites and cultural assets. So I've been very impressed with that, because there's clearly an awareness at the highest levels of the government here that unless Sri Lanka gets it right now, there's a very strong likelihood that big disasters will follow in the coming years.
Considering the past 20 years since the first Earth Summit, there have been both drawbacks and improvements in the condition of the Earth and its inhabitants. For example, the number of people living on less than $1 a day has decreased in every region of the developing world. Average life expectancy has increased, but the number of people in poverty is still more than 1 billion. And on climate change, one of the most pressing environmental issues of our time, the evidence is worrying. Since 1990, carbon dioxide emissions have increased by almost 40%, and the 10 hottest years since temperature measurements began have all occurred in the past 15 years, and heat waves continue year after year. Even though Rio Plus 20 did not produce any firm agreements, hopefully awareness that it created will help some sectors into action. That's all we have on Global Perspectives tonight. If you missed any parts of the show, you can look us up on webtv.lk. Hope you join us again next week at the same time on MTV Sports. Thank you for joining us, and good night.